Today. So we're starting by taking a look at the controversy surrounding Dave Chappelle's latest comedy special. In the special, Chappelle says things like, quote, gender is a fact, and that the LGBTQ plus people community are, quote, too sensitive. So this led to a walkout this week staged by Netflix staff and transgender activists. So Sean, what's your reaction to how this has played out?
My first reaction is that perhaps it's time we put the stand-up special to rest. Just for a little bit, because we are unable to have these complex conversations about intersectionality in a form that doesn't support it. And I watched the Dave Chappelle special with a group of friends, different identity combinations, and it provoked a very long conversation, which was productive.
Oh.
But ultimately, I think that the form lets down the conversation that needs to be had.
And yet in your case, you did have a good conversation. Like, that's interesting to me. You had a group of diverse friends and you actually had a conversation. I'm guessing people were coming from different opinions about it.
Right. I think that the problem with the conversation was that we were trying to figure out if it was, if its actual existence was right or not, and we missed the messaging. And it sort of, it was productive, but ultimately, I don't think that it was harmful as a queer person.
Aisha, you're a comedian as well. I'm curious your thoughts on this.
I mean, the first thing is, I think I am not trans. I would consider myself to be part of the queer community, but I'm not known as that. So my sensibilities aren't the ones that are the most important in this conversation, to be frank. He's not speaking at me or to me. I also feel like it's a really slippery slope when we start to say we should decide what should be out there and what shouldn't be out there, if a special should be on or should be taken down because it hurts some people. I mean, I think that in the end, even the folks at Netflix who wanted to walk out were saying they didn't want the special to be taken off the air necessarily, but what they did want is a deeper conversation about whose voices are represented. And so, as we know, in most of media, there aren't a ton of trans voices. There aren't a ton of LGBTQ plus community voices, or as many as there are other voices. So when there are less of those voices to counterpoint against some of the things that are in the Chappelle special, it makes it really lopsided. So we're only seeing this one side, and then we're seeing a whole lot of other comedy specials from men or white people or people who are not part of this marginalized community as marginalized. I mean, I know that Dave Chappelle does all these comparisons about being Black and being trans and being LGBTQ, and it's kind of like some parts of it were like, I kind of feel like he's saying the equivalent of I have a Black friend, you know what I mean? When it's like talking about having a trans person who he was working with well, and I was like, yeah, that's exactly the thing that we hate hearing from people who are talking about Black people. So, I mean, it's very complex. It's very, very complex. I think the big thing is if the goal is to have Chappelle change, that's a bigger, more difficult, and like, why are we trying to do that conversation? But then if that were the goal, then let's have him sit down face to face with some people from these communities that he has harmed. Let's have him sit down with some people from the LGBTQ community, with the trans community, who want to have a space that's safe to talk about it and get to know each other and discuss how it has harmed them, and not just be throwing daggers at him, like he says, with these talking points, but honestly come together and speak as human beings and feel each other's energies and hurts.
Yeah.
I think the latest report today is that either from him or his representatives, they said that he was open to sitting down with trans people and trans activists to like open up this conversation. But I think that the reason why this has been, it's now 2 weeks, the special came out 2 weeks ago, and so this conversation has been front and center in Hollywood for 2 weeks. Number one, because it's Dave Chappelle, and he is the most successful and the most revered, for lack of a better word, stand up right now in the space. And number two, because Netflix is Netflix, right? It's a big deal. And the other conversation that's happening is how Netflix reacted to this situation. Their employees, including trans employees, came forward. They didn't feel heard. A memo went out from the head of Netflix, Ted Sarandos, that was quite disrespectful. It didn't feel very inclusive. And then a female trans employee was fired for talking about the situation and revealing information about the valuable, mysterious Netflix algorithm. And so it just, it says to people like, wow, so, you are willing to stand by Dave Chappelle, but your employees are coming forward, and then one gets fired because you're like, oh, protect our IP and our algorithm. It just didn't feel right and sit right with people.
I understand that. I mean, it is such a complicated story. And I mean, as somebody who, full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of Dave Chappelle, and I don't think his comedy always lands, and sometimes it makes me deeply uncomfortable. But I think his heart is in the right place. And I think that's the lens that I'm seeing this story through. And again, like Aisha, to your point, like, I think maybe my lens doesn't matter as a white, cis, mostly heterosexual person. I don't think that necessarily matters what I think. But what I do, I guess, hope for, first of all, let me just say, I haven't seen this special, so it's a bit unfair for me to really comment deeply on it, but he has definitely talked about the LGBTQ community in his comedy in the past, and he has pointed out, and I'll never forget this, I'm gonna paraphrase his line, he said he never makes fun of anything that he doesn't see himself in. And so I don't know that if that means that a part of him identifies with the queer community in a way that he hasn't disclosed.
Yeah.
I don't know what the full story is, but he definitely feels a connection and then therefore feels licensed to kind of poke fun. Yeah. Whether or not you agree with that is another story. And then the other thing is I just wonder, as this sort of, anger has fueled up in the media and there's been this focus on him, he is a black man. And yes, he is a powerful black man at this point in time in history because of his success, but there's something about that doesn't sit quite right with me. And I hope that people are being as adamant about their anger and fueling their anger towards like entities that are actually very powerful also and are consistently doing harm. I'm looking at you, religious, right, conservatives.
Yeah.
Like, are you as outraged on Twitter at that as you are lobbing at Dave Chappelle?
Well, and I think that he feels like he's part of these communities because it's quite evident that Dave Chappelle is hurt. He's a hurting person. He is a black man in this, in America. So I would venture to say almost all black people in America are hurting. And he identifies with a marginalized group who has been oppressed, who hurts. I mean, Dave Chappelle, I'm a fan of Dave Chappelle's as well. I think that there's a lot of funny things. I think that it's kind of universal that he's a well-known, really successful, great comedian. And again, not everything lands, but he's also one of the things he talks about is how he is part of the people in the groups that have been kind of crapped on or oppressed by other people. He's just not getting, I think, that there is intersectionality, like you were talking about, Sean, where there are multiple different things happening for people who are also black, who are also trans, who, all these different levels that aren't just this one label that you can put on it.
Oh, and what I thought was, at the beginning of the special, I was really into what he was saying about how our identities as, and I'll speak specifically to my identity as a gay man, how it intersects race and capitalism and how we can choose to be marginalized until we're white. And at that point, I was like, oh, he's going to say it. He's going to say it. What I wanted was, and what I longed for, is an opportunity for a gay man to stand on stage in a stand-up special in North America and address that part of his identity and make his audience uncomfortable. And we're still at a point where I can't put my finger on a gay comedian with a stand-up special yet.
Good point.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good point, Sean, because I mean, I don't know that, like, for example, Hannah Gadsby, I think that we don't know whether or not like they refer to themselves as a comedian. They wanted to get out of comedy, right? And so like that is because their work is more like social commentary and less of your say a joke, laugh, ha, 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 and then say a joke, laugh, ha, ha. Like it's more of a presentation, like a TED Talk that is in the form of, there are some comedic elements. But I think that that's also where comedy is heading. There are lots of so-called comedians who are pushing comedy in a different direction from what it used to be, because that space wasn't necessarily inclusive. And we've heard lots of, and Aisha, I mean, you can talk about this, and we've heard lots of reports over the last few years about this space and like, who gets to be in stand-up? It's a buddy-buddy system. And I think that even though, yes, Dave Chappelle is a Black man and there are certain things that are associated with his experience, in the comedy world, he is a god.
Yeah.
You know, a few days after this special came out, he was at the Hollywood Bowl cheering, thousands of people cheering him. And his words were, if this is what canceled feels like, not bad. You know what I mean?
I know.
And so
I think we want comedy to continue to open up conversations like what Sean was saying and also push the envelope. And sometimes they're going to make mistakes. And then hopefully it sounds like Dave's doing the right work to try to mitigate that harm. I mean.